Welcome to Tomorrow Never Knows with me, Bob Wilson, and Sir Warren Brown of the fabulous Beatles Kingdom. Our guest in this episode is the wonderful author Jude Sutherland Kessler. Lend us your ears, and we promise to give you a show. Shanana na 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 na. Hey Jude, how are you tonight?
I love that. I did not realize that you were a rapper as well as everything else.
There you go.
That's a good one, Jude. Thank you.
That's a wrap. There you go. I think Warren has a question for you there. So, Warren, are you ready with a question for our wonderful author?
First of all, I'd like to welcome you to the show. It's so nice to have you on, and your voice is so magnificent.
Oh man, that Southern accent just keeps drawing along. I
Oh,
hear myself and think,
it,
oh, it's terrible.
it's knocking
I
me
hear,
off my chair, so.
oh, thank you very much. I'm so glad to be here, and thank you both very much for inviting me. I truly appreciate it.
And that's no problem. Thank you for being here. My first question I'm going to ask is can you tell us about the books you've done and the next one that might be coming out soon, I hear?
Absolutely, absolutely. I have spent the last 33 years working on the John Lennon series, which is going to be, I think, a series of 9 books telling John's life story via a historical narrative format. So you're reading it like you would read a novel or a narrative, but everything is documented and researched. And in the last book, there were 4,400 some odd footnotes. So everything that the Beatles are saying, they said. What they have on, what they're wearing, they wore. What they're doing in the studio, they really did. What they have to eat is what they ate. In most instances, in fact, I just had a good friend of mine, a reader from Canada, Owen Coppin, write to me, and he said, Jude, I appreciate all the research you do, but I just wanted to let you know that when the Beatles were in Vancouver, you have them eating chicken fingers, and that's not true. They actually ate 19-cent hamburgers and French fries, and that's how deep into the weeds we get. So it
Wow.
reads like a novel, but you're getting exactly what happened almost day by day. And there are 4 of the books are out, and I'm currently working on volume 5. The first book, which took me 20 years to write, goes from John's birth up to December of 1961. So that covers the biggest territory. You know, John grows up, he goes through the terrible childhood that he has. He is, for complicated reasons, abandoned by both of his parents. He comes to live with his Aunt Mimi and his Uncle George, goes to school, grows up at the time when he needs George the most, when he's 14 and a half and needs that male role model. His beloved uncle dies and he loses really his best friend. And at that point, his mother comes back into his life, becomes his constant companion, and encourages him to do practical jokes with her, teaches him to play the banjo, and gets him to hang out with her at 1 Blomfield Road, her house. And at one point, he's, as he put it, suspended. He's suspended from school for 3 weeks, and he stays with his mother for those 3 weeks, never telling his aunt that he's suspended during that time, and
Mm,
falls under her magical sway. And she convinces him that he has music in his bones and he needs to form a band. And so he starts the Quarrymen, ends up, putting the band together, and begins to meet the real members of the Quarrymen. First Paul, then through Paul, George Harrison. And then they have a friend who is in another band that they know about, but he's not in the group, Ringo Starr. Well, by the end of that book, they have gone to Hamburg twice. The band has morphed from the Quarrymen into the Beatles, and the only thing they don't have is a permanent drummer. They have Pete Best with them, but Pete was hired the night before they went to Hamburg, and he's only temporary. They've always known that, and they're looking for a drummer. And Brian Epstein has just discovered them on the 9th of November at the Cavern Club and has offered them management. The last page of
mhm,
that book is the night that he offers them that loose managerial agreement, and John says, right, manage us then. And
mm,
that's the end of book 1. That's the longest book. Book 2 takes you up through 1961, from that evening up to 63. So they are famous in England, in Scotland, in Ireland, in Germany.
Right.
No one knows them anywhere else. I mean, they're on the cusp. And in that book, they finally get a hit with Love Me Do. They go to #1 with Please Please Me. John and Cynthia get married. Pete leaves the band. Ringo comes into the band. They are one day in EMI recording the Please Please Me LP during the worst winter in England's history, in that cold Studio 2. John has flu, the rest of the band is sick, and in one day they record that LP that sends them into the toppermost of the poppermost, what John always dreamed. And the end of that book is that Cynthia has John and Cynthia's first baby, Julian, and after Cynthia comes home from the hospital, he announces to Cynthia that he is going with their manager, Brian Epstein, to Spain for 14 days on holiday. And book 3 picks up in Spain, and it goes with Brian and John all through the Spanish Riviera, and traces how they cement their friendship, become friends forever. John begins to understand Brian's outlook on life. Back in the 1960s, Brian was, as we would say today, gay. Back then, they would have termed him as homosexual. It was illegal. Begins to understand what Brian is coping with and to see the world through Brian's eyes, and they become very close friends. In that book, which is 1963, the Beatles really take hold. Beatlemania is coined, the term is coined. It breaks out all over. Reporters are following them everywhere they go. John and Cynthia finally go on a long delayed honeymoon to Paris, and they decide that she needs to move to London to be with John because he's always in the smoke, as they call London. So she moves down there. They get an apartment in Emperor's Gate, and the Beatles are so big that they're asked to play the Sunday night at the London Palladium, which is a kind of equivalent to our Ed Sullivan show. It's so big that Ringo's relatives always used to say it. They had this big saying in their family, play the Palladium and die. And so he's so nervous the night that they go on to that show that Ringo throws up in a bucket right before they go on stage. I mean, it's big to go on that show. About 2 or 3 weeks later, they play for royalty at the Royal Command Performance. Then they end the year doing their first Beatles record and going off to Paris for 3 weeks in January to perform in France. First time ever that they performed in Paris. And while they're there, they get the news that they've gone to #1 on the American charts. And that is so advantageous because they are headed to America to play 3 Ed Sullivan shows. And they get on the plane, they take off, they think they're going to be failures and that no one's going to care about them and they're going to come home embarrassed. But what they find out is they are the toast of the town. I mean, the screen, just, it's off the charts. And they have wonderful time over in America. They play not only those Ed Sullivan shows, but Carnegie Hall, and they play in the round in Washington, D.C., and they are just on top of the world. And so that's the end of book 3. Book 4 is they come home and they start making A Hard Day's Night, and then those boys who dreamed of going to the toppermost of the poppermost begin to find out what being famous is all about. They get up at 5 a.m., they go into hair and makeup. They are on set at 8 a.m. They film until noon. At noon, everybody has a lunch break, but not the Beatles, because they have to do interviews and they have to do radio shows during the lunch hour. They film all afternoon, and then the other actors go home, but not the Beatles, because they go to other studios to film television shows like Ready, Steady, Go. And they work until 10 o'clock at night and stumble home dead tired at 10 o'clock at night. They've been up since 5. John has Tom Mashler with Jonathan Cape Publishers waiting for him in Emperor's Gate to help John illustrate and edit his book, which is coming out in just a few weeks. He works till midnight on that, sleeps just a few hours, and does it all over again. And the whole year is like that. They go on a world tour. They do live Sunday concerts all through the summer in England. They go on the North American tour. They come home. They record Beatles for Sale. They go on the UK tour. They do the Christmas record. They do another Beatles Christmas show. And they find out that this stuff called fame is nothing but hard work. They have almost no vacations, no rest, and that's the end of book 4. And right now, I'm working on book 5, and I've gotten up as far as the time when they're in the Bahamas filming Help. And what they have discovered is this year, this 1965 is going to be a carbon copy of 64. They're going to make a film. John is going to write a second book. They're going to go on another world tour. They're going to do another North American tour. They're going to do another UK tour. They're going to do 2 albums. They're going to do 45s. They're going to do a Christmas record. It's going to be the same thing, except for this time the excitement has vanished. You know, this is going to take you all the way through John's career, and you're with him almost daily on these adventures.
Wow, it sounds like they're as busy as I have been lately. So,
well, then I feel sorry for you, Warren, because that's a hard schedule.
I'm telling you, I've had a hard one myself here lately. So, but I know one sweet woman who sent me a copy of your 3rd book, and it is autographed, and I appreciate that very much. And is this the last of your series, or do you have more planned?
Oh no, it's going to go all the way through John's life. I mean, like I'm working on book 5 now, and then we'll keep going book by book. Book 5 will be 1965. Hopefully, book 6 will take you up to 67. And then we'll get into the solo years. But the books are huge. I mean, they're 900 pages. I had to laugh.
Yes.
Some lady on Amazon dinged me because she said that the book that I sent to you was too short, and that book is it's 900 pages. She gave me a bad review because she said it was too short. Well, lady, how long did you want it to be?
Well, to be honest with you, when I got the book, I was like, oh my God.
It's big.
So I'm not a fast reader. So this book's going to take me a while to read.
And it's written in segments of one day. So you can pick it up, just read that one day and then set it down and, move on. But it is, they're long and they're very involved. I have to find out things that a typical biographer wouldn't need to know because it's not important. I just put in a call to Ruth and Angie McCartney and said, I need to talk to you guys because I read Angie's book, The Long and Winding Road, and I know that you were in the Bahamas when the Beatles were there, but I need to know strange things like, do you have any photos of what you had on? Because I need to describe the clothes you were wearing. Do you remember what the flight was like? Do you remember any of the food that you ate? I have to fill in minute details. So I take a different approach.
Yes, that's a very detailed book there. Very detailed research too. A lot of work. What do you call your style of biography?
It's called a narrative history, and it's a very old style that the Greeks started. In fact, Thucydides wrote his history of the Peloponnesian War in this style. You tell it as a story, but you make sure that you don't add or subtract any facts. And that's really important because I had another person on Amazon say, well, I don't like that Jude Sutherland Kessler because she puts in bad stories about John. She must not like John because why would she include the bad things he did? These are histories. This is history.
Yes.
And John did some great things, some wonderful things, some amazing things, and he did some really horrible things. It's a history. You have to tell exactly what the person did. You
That's
can't
correct.
change it, you can't alter it. You just have to tell the truth. And so I don't think that I hate John, or I wouldn't have given 33 years of my life to tell his story, but
I agree.
I am going to tell the truth.
Right. You do such excellent work that has a focus on John. What made him stand out to you in comparison to the other three Beatles?
Well, of course, when I was a little girl, I became a John Lennon fan at age 9. And at that time, I remember you probably heard me tell this story before, but I got to school at 8 in the morning, and my friend Patty Singer thrust a 45 sleeve in my hand and said, "These are the Beatles. You have until recess to fall in love with one." I'm like, what? Fall in love until recess? 2 hours to fall in love with a Beatle. And originally I picked George, just from the photo, but I could tell my friends were disappointed. That's not, who they thought I was going to pick. And so I went home that night and started calling the big sisters of my friends and saying, okay, who are these Beatles now? And what's going on with all this? And who are they? And I found out that John was considered the leader Beatle and the smart Beatle, and that he liked to write and he loved to read. And those were all the things that I liked. So the next day I went back and said, oh, okay, I changed my mind. I'm going to pick John. And they're like, yeah, we knew it. And so, that initially that was the connection. But as I started learning about his life story and how horrible his life was, and how many serious tragedies he faced without letting those tragedies defeat him, and how he took all of the tragic things that happened to him and transformed them into beautiful, emotional, poignant music that changed all of our lives. That was
I,
a story worth telling.
yes, I agree. And it is nice to listen to it too. John's image has become somewhat distant from the actual person, which goes with uh, basically any star. How would you describe John, comparison to John, the actual person?
Well, you and we had talked a little bit before the show, full disclosure to everyone listening. So I knew
Hmm.
that Warren was going to ask me that question. And I looked through Tony Barrow's book. John, Paul, George, Ringo, and Me has a great part about John in there, but it was too long to use. But I found a great quote in Fred Seaman's book, The Last Day of John Lennon. Let me just read you this short quote and then we'll talk about it.
Sounds
It
good.
says, one day John would be upbeat and witty, the next sullen and withdrawn. He oscillated between supreme self-confidence and grave self-doubt. When he was in a bad mood, he was highly irritable. The slightest grievance could provoke a stinging rebuke. At times like these, John was best left alone. He was subject to erratic mood swings. So, I mean, you cannot put John into a cage and say, okay, this is John. He is always a peacenik. He wants to bring peace to the world. He wants to stand up for women's rights. He wants to march for Irish freedom. He wants to do good. He did all those things, every bit of that. He took
Hmm.
money and he bought flak jackets for the New York City police because they couldn't afford any at that time. And he took his money and he bought every single policeman in New York flak jackets.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he gave money to all sorts of foundations to help people who were hungry and in need. He helped people in Liverpool, but he kept quiet about it. He didn't make a big deal. He didn't talk about it a lot. I
Right.
can tell you, every single reporter that ever traveled with John Lennon, whether it's Art Schreiber, Ivor Davis, Larry Kane, every single one, when you say to them, tell me about your relationship with the Beatles. They all say John was my favorite. There's no doubt about it. He was articulate. He was funny. He was well read. He read a book a week, sometimes more, 3 newspapers a day. Very fun to talk with, very honest. There are all kinds of good things you could say. I mean, everybody knows he was a brilliant artist, a brilliant composer, all that. And I'm not going to say but, because but negates everything you said in front of and he was also very taciturn. He would get mad at an instant, and we'll talk about why in a while, because we're going to talk about his life a little bit more. But he was very easily angered. He always thought that you were out to get him, and so until he knew the person, he would be rude to you first to see how you reacted. If that put you off and it made you walk away from him, then fine. But if you could take it and dish it right back to him and you stood toe to toe with him, he respected you and you could become really, really good friends. John, at one point of his life, was very, very liberal. Later in his life, he admired Ronald Reagan and was more conservative. At one point in his life, he said women should be obscene and not heard. Later in his life, he sang, and I guess I probably can't say the term without getting in trouble, even though the NAACP said he could use that title. So we'll say what woman is the N of the world, meaning she's treated terribly, horribly, and he stood up for women's rights. Right. John was, you could never put him in one little cubicle and say that's John Lennon. He was never a saint. He was never just a sinner. He was varied on any given day.
Yes, for all the reasons you just described, is one reason why John is my favorite Beatle and also my idol. And with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to the Bulldog.
Part of my favorite parts of reading the book is because you fleshed out John's relationship with Cynthia. And although she gets mentioned sometime, and I've read her own book, I thought your book did a better job of it, although I enjoyed her book too. I'm not saying I didn't. But, John was very young at the time, and fame had just hit him and such. But could you tell us a bit about that, like John and Cynthia and Julian, like what your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, you and I were talking on the phone the other day about Cynthia and their relationship. And I think what people really forget is that when in our current day, let's just start there. In our current day, the myth is that John only ever loved Yoko. That's it. And that he never loved anyone else. But we need to remember that he met Cynthia at Liverpool College of Art when he is just a student in college. And they really, after knowing each other for about a year, and she had a mad crush on him. He didn't even really give her the time of day, but she was head over heels over him. But at the end of term blast at Liverpool College of Art in the late 50s, he finally noticed Cynthia and asked her to dance. And of course, she stumbled all over herself and he said, would you fancy going out with me then? And she said, well, I'm kind of engaged to someone else. And he got mad and said, I didn't ask you to marry me, did I? And so he stalks off embarrassed because she didn't say, yes, I'll go out with you. And so she follows him to the pub and waits all night for him to give her another chance. And he absolutely won't even look at her. And so finally around 10 o'clock, she stands up to leave and he shouts to the whole pub, ye crack. He says, didn't you know that Miss Powell's a nun then? And everybody laughs and she laughs and he walks over and grabs her hand. They walk over to Stu's flat. And from that magical night on, this is where you fade to black in movies because it's private. But after that night, they're an item. Look, that's 1958. They don't divorce until the end of the 1960s. They have a 10-year relationship. They get married in August of 1962. And they're married for 6 years. This is not some fly-by-night relationship that you see in Hollywood where they're married and a year later they're married to someone else. They loved each other. If you look in Ray Coleman's book, Lennon, there is a letter that John wrote to Cynthia their first Christmas together. And it is, I love, 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 XXOO, and a drawing of them together with hearts all around them, our first Christmas. There's no doubt about it. He loved Cynthia. When he was on the 1964 North American tour, Art Schreiber, Larry Kane, and Ivor Davis, all three told me that John called Cynthia every single night, except for one. The one night that they had to get on the plane, they found out that the police had been pretty abusive to them during the Cleveland concert, and they found out that they were going to be turned out of their hotel. So rather than going to the hotel, they got right on the plane and left. He couldn't get to a telephone that night, so he didn't call her, but every other night he called her from that tour. When the Beatles go to Paris in January of 1964, they're given one day off. Paul, George, and Ringo tour Paris. They go out to Versailles. They have a lovely time seeing the city. John gets on a plane and flies home to London to spend the night with his wife. He loves her. And that relationship, as it begins to fall apart, and Cynthia says in both of her books, A Twist of Lennon and her later book, which came out in 2005, John, she says drugs were the cause. That John needed the drugs to escape the pressures of Beatledom, and she couldn't stand it. And it made her sick. It made her feel terrible. And she thought that as a mother, she needed to be alert and aware. So he goes down one path and she goes down another. And already Cynthia was not exactly the kind of girl that John loved, always loved, and would always love one woman, Julia Stanley Lennon, his mother. That is his ideal by which he measures every other woman. And Julia is bohemian. She's out of the box. She's an artist. She's unique. She's strange. She's different. She's bold. She's outspoken. And Cynthia was none of those things. So already they had that against them. But then as drugs intervene, they really began to go separate ways. And finally, by the end of the 1960s, Yoko comes into play and pursues John madly. I mean, she's sending him letters every day. She shows up everywhere that the Lennons go. She's there. At one point, they go to hear the Maharishi talk, and when they come out, she's standing outside the building and says, "Can I have a ride with you?" and jumps into the limousine between the two of them. And Cynthia's like, "John, what's going on here? What's up with this girl?" And John says, "Oh, I don't know. She's some crazy artist. I don't know. I have nothing to do with her." But Yoko doesn't give up. She keeps pursuing him and pursuing him and pursuing him. Even when they go to India, she sends him postcards over to Rishikesh. And so, at some point, he begins to realize, if I want that bold bohemian artist that I've always yearned for, Cynthia's not the one, and begins to be interested in Yoko, and the rest is history. So, Yoko is very real in his life and changes him in many ways for the better, in that she convinces him to fight for women's rights and to work for peace and to do a lot of things. But Cynthia played a tremendous role, because on John and Cynthia's honeymoon night, John invites Cynthia to come with him on his gig. And she says, "Oh, no. I'm going to stay home and you go and pursue your dream." Had she said to him, "Oh, yeah, I'm going to be part of all this. I want to be in this and sitting with you, next to you, and in studio with you," he would have let her. He absolutely would have let her. And if she would have said, "John, I want you to give all this up and stay home with me and with your son," I think he probably would have acquiesced, because he believed that he needed to do what was right. And he was raised by Mimi to believe that duty was very, very important. Cynthia never asked him to do that. She always encouraged him, bragged on him, let him go off on tours, told him to go and pursue his dream. She is really responsible for his feeling that he could make the Beatles number one. And so I think Cynthia is greatly overlooked in John Lennon's history.
The things I find most interesting in your work is the things you bring out that get overlooked. And in that theme, Dylan and Lennon had a very interesting relationship, Bob Dylan. And, Dylan in 78 converted to Christianity, put out 3 overtly Christian records, like with Serve Somebody, Saved and Shot of Love. And John at first spoofed it with Serve Yourself. But some of the stuff you've been talking about to me, before we came on tonight, was how the movie Jesus of Nazareth affected John greatly. And he actually was writing some Christian songs himself, and that seems to be one of the things that gets overlooked in all this that I find very interesting. I think you sensed the question in that, so I leave it to you.
Yeah, what we've got to realize is that in some cases, for example, in the Cynthia case, we're being fed a narrative. When you go see Lennon on Broadway, though, a few years ago, Cynthia wasn't even in the play. I mean, she wasn't in the play. So, hello, that's 10 years of his life, and somebody that was very important to him, the mother of his child, that is missing from the play. History can be changed, and it can be changed for many reasons. Sometimes a person wants to change history because they want to insert themselves into history, or they want to alter something that happened because they consider it offensive, or there are a lot of reasons. And if you study historiography, they talk about why people change history. Well, John Lennon's history is being altered in some crucial ways, and removing Cynthia from his history is one of them. So, let's just first look at the Dylan relationship. If you go back and look at John's songs that he wrote before he met Bob Dylan, especially the songs that were written for the Hard Day's Night LP, which he wrote that before he meets Bob Dylan at the end of August 1964. He's never met Dylan. He's listened to Freewheeling, and he respects Bob Dylan, but he's never talked to him, never had any influence from Bob. And the songs that are on A Hard Day's Night are highly, highly autobiographical songs. Many of the songs that John wrote on the first LPs are also highly autobiographical. And yet there's this rumor that John doesn't write autobiographical songs until he meets Dylan, and Dylan says to him, man, why don't you start writing about more songs like you write poems that go in your books, write about yourself. And suddenly John Lennon becomes autobiographical. That in itself is an untruth. John always wrote about himself from day one. So that's the first thing. Second thing, when you're talking about him writing that song, Serve Somebody, let's go back and look at what caused John to write a song like that. I don't know if John was as much offended by Dylan's Christian stance as he was by Dylan's suggestion that you serve God. Because John, at that point when he wrote Serve Somebody, if you think about when he wrote it, he writes it when the Beatles are in ruins. His dream is in ruins. The only thing that preserved him through years of loneliness and tragedy was the Beatles, and it's in ruins. And John is saying in Serve Somebody that he believes you have to be self-reliant, that he has just sung in the song God, I don't believe in Zimmerman, I don't believe in Elvis, I don't believe in Buddha, I don't believe in Kennedy, I don't believe in Jesus, I just believe in me. And later he amends that to say Yoko and me. Because throughout his life up to this point, what John has found out is that when you are abandoned, as he was, his dad went to sea, came home, tried to take John to live with him, but then Julia, his mother, John's mother, at the very last minute comes and confronts them. And according to John, I don't care what other biographers say, according to John, and he tells this story, if you look in Fred Seaman's book, the personal memoir by Fred on the last days of John Lennon, he sits Sean down and he says to Sean, my parents put me between the two of them and made me choose. So whatever anyone else says, this is the reality to John, and perception is reality, that his parents made him choose. He chooses his mother, and then she sends him to live with her sister instead of keeping him. So he feels like he's been abandoned by his mother. He's been abandoned by his father. He lives with his aunt. She's not loving to him. His uncle, the only one who loves him, the only one who treats him in a kind way, dies. Then his mother comes back into his life. She bonds with him. And what happens? She dies. And then he replaces his mother's love with the love of a brother, a best friend, Stu. And what happens? He dies. So John is saying in this song, when you're abandoned over and over, when you're hurt over and over, when you're betrayed over and over, what happens to you? You start to become gun shy. And you think that everyone and everything eventually is going to let you down. So don't trust anybody. Don't trust a friend. Don't trust family. Don't trust religion. Just serve yourself. He's very, at this point that he's writing the song, very cynical and bitter. But the deal about John Lennon is, like most intellectual people, I think there's some people who can just be happy with 3 square meals a day and a telly. Let's watch a little telly at night. John Lennon wasn't one of those people. He was always searching for significance. And he tries to get that sometimes from people. If I leave my wife, Cynthia, and I go off and I get another new wife, maybe that will make me happy. Or if I'm having trouble with Yoko and I go off and I spend time with May, which he adored May Pang, and she was so good for him and so inspirational. But, maybe that will save me. Maybe that will make me happy. He definitely seeks it in a career. If I can just get to the toppermost of the poppermost, I'm going to be happy. If I can just write a book, that's going to make me happy. He wrote both of his books, despite the fact that Brian told him not to write those books, that he had too much to do as a Beatle, because he was searching for significance. He needed fulfillment. And then he starts to realize, look, nothing is making me happy. My family did not make me happy. In fact, they made me miserable. I had close friends, Pete Shotton, Stu, who was like his soulmate, the Beatles, and yet I'm not happy. Rock and roll, I thought rock and roll would save my soul, and yet I'm not happy. And then I had wealth and I had fame, and I got the Foyles Literary Award for being the greatest writer in England, and I wasn't happy. I had this fair-haired girl, the princess that you saved from the tower. I had Cynthia, I had Yoko, I had May, had thousands of girls who adored me. I'm not happy. I tried drugs, and I'm not happy. I tried meditation. I went to the Maharishi. I tried stronger drugs, heroin, everything. I'm not happy. I thought, well, okay, I failed with my first son, but if Yoko and I can just have a child, that'll do it. I'll be a house husband, and I'll be, I'll put everything into being a good father, and I'm not happy. I'm going to move from Liverpool. I'm going to go to New York, and I'm going to be happy there. But John, wherever you go, there you are. You're still there. I'm not happy. So nothing is fulfilling John, and nothing is filling that hole in his heart. So he just keeps searching, and he keeps looking. At one point, in this book that Fred Seaman wrote, he talks about John trying to find that fulfillment in reading about books on philosophy and faith. In fact, at one point, he sends Fred into a bookshop to buy every single book that he can find about philosophy and the occult. He buys a book about theosophy, which is an ancient occult science. He buys a book by the psychic Edgar Cayce. Back in the early 1960s, Gene Dixon made a prediction that the Beatles plane was going to crash. And George and John called her and talked with her and said, really, is this going to happen? And she said, I don't know who made that up. I never said that. Fly, go on your trip. I never said that. He was always interested in things like that. He's searching for meaning. He's searching for significance. Well, long story. I mean, this is a long story, kind of condensed. When John and Yoko visited Japan, they went 4 summers in a row, 76 through 80. They go to this beautiful mountain resort. And I don't know if I'll say this right or not. I think it's Karazawa, near the mountains in Japan. There have been some residences that are built there that people can stay in, built by missionaries. Andrew Croft Shaw was the first Canadian missionary that came into this beautiful town and built these summer residences. And John and Yoko were staying there. And he has been reading at this point. He has seen the miniseries, Jesus of Nazareth. And although he makes a bunch of sarcastic comments during the show and is in one of those moods where he keeps saying, just get on with this and, this is nothing and all that, it's put a bug in his brain. And he's been thinking about his roots in the Anglican Church, how he grew up as a little boy in what in America we would term as the Episcopal Church. He had a bad taste in his mouth for organized religion because he was pretty much during those days when he's living with Mimi and Uncle George, he is bad to the bone. He steals the grapes off of his church's altar harvest. He's drawing caricatures of the priest and of people in the choir, and he's making jokes in church, and he's being a typical 9, 10, 11-year-old bad boy. And so the priest, Reverend Price Jones, calls Mimi and says, I hate to tell you, but your nephew is banned from St. Peter's. He can't come back anymore. And she's like, what? And he's like, no, he's misbehaved for the last time. I'm done with him. And furthermore, I'm done with you and your husband as well. None of you can come back. Well, I mean, that hurt John's heart because, he cried about it and said, you didn't do anything, Mimi. Why is he punishing you? And why, I can understand him not letting me come back, but why are you being punished? So John had always had a very bitter taste in his mouth about organized religion. But that summer after he sees Jesus of Nazareth, he starts talking to missionaries about the person that he saw in that mini-series, this Jesus. He first talks to a couple of Norwegian missionaries, and Yoko is with him when he's talking to the Norwegian missionaries, and she begins to really fire questions at them about, how do you know that Christ is divine? What's your proof of that? Show me the proof. And she kind of really intervenes and tries to shut down this line of questioning. But then John runs into a lady named Carol Fleenor, Fleenor, who talks with John for over an hour. And at the end of the time that they talk about their sons, their family, and this searching for significance that he's doing as he's retracing his steps in Christianity, he says to her, I've been speaking with a lot of missionaries because I've been looking for something this summer, something spiritual. The missionaries I've met here have told me a little bit about it, about life and what it means. So thank you for your words and thank you for sharing with me today. And he goes on to begin reading books about faith, all based on what he saw in that film. It reignited his curiosity about Jesus and about the fact that maybe this could fill the hole in his heart. Well, we all, we don't have a private view into what happened to John after that summer, but we do see that around his neck, in the last photos ever taken of him in his New York shirt, that sleeveless shirt that says New York City on it, he is wearing his cross. May Pang, who was with him during some of that time, has reissued the cross that John was wearing in those last photos. And on maypang.com, she's actually selling them with the same chain that John wore. And it's a beautiful, complete representation, rendering of that cross. So John was always looking for something to fill the hole in his heart. And toward the end of his life, he is writing songs of faith. He writes Crossing the Jordan, Talking to Jesus, Amen. And you can tell he is still looking for that faith that will fill the longing he's had all of his life, which none of these other things were able to fill, and which he chased without ever coming to satisfaction.
So I hand it over to Warren as I ruminate.
Well, switching gears a little bit here, I was wondering if you liked any particular artist or photographer that worked with the Beatles. I enjoy Klaus Vorman very much. What do you like? Any album cover or such?
Well, of course, Klaus did brilliant work, and I've been very fortunate to be able to meet him at the Fest for Beatles fans a couple of times. And of course, the first time that I met him, I was so starstruck that I went up and I said, Mr. Vorman, I just feel like I know you, because in my first book, the Beatles go to Hamburg twice. And, of course, you're there front and center. And to meet you in person is just magnificent. And he just stared at me and said nothing. So the next time I met him, I tried not to act so starstruck. But, when you meet someone like that that's bigger than life, you really always say the dumbest thing you can ever say. But I love the work of Robert Freeman, and he, of course, captured that light and shade picture of the Beatles, and that is just iconic. And I think that for those early days when Brian wasn't allowing them to step outside of the box too much because he wanted them to appeal to the masses, Robert Freeman took them to as close to the cutting edge as anyone could take them without being avant-garde. If he had gotten too frou-frou, Brian would have said, no, this isn't going to appeal to the average teenager and the average mother and father of those teenagers. But he was very, he did beautiful work, and he did work that is still today so haunting and such a lovely representation of these boys in the early 1960s.
In the Beatles Kingdom on Facebook, I post a great deal of my art on there, my graphic art. I would be honored if I could ever provide some artwork for you or advertise your podcast or anything else. Please tell us about your podcast.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much for saying that. And I'll have to go in and look at your art. I work so hard that I rarely ever look at anything on Facebook. I go on Facebook, I post, I go off. I know a lot of people are able to spend time, and someone will say, I messaged you on Facebook, and I'll say, well, I'm off as fast as I can because I try to work 24/7. But thank you very much for that offer. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Okay, I do a podcast with my best friend, Lena Stagg. Lena, and we were going to talk about this in a minute. I'll just go ahead and tell you about it right now. Lena is the author of the Recipe Records series of books. She is so savvy about all kinds of music from the 1950s all the way up to today. She can talk about Frank Sinatra as well as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, as well as Counting Crows and the Foo Fighters and the Black Keys. She is a music guru. And so she and her friend, Maggie McHugh, who passed away a few years ago.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, they were very, very close. And it was a tragic, Lena really almost did not recover from the loss of her friend. It wasn't until a little dog wandered up to her house and came to live with her. And she didn't want that dog because she was grieving. And she took the dog because her children wanted it. But she noticed that the dog always, because the dog was so tiny and sickly and weak, she would always go outside and go for the patch of sun that she could find and go right to the patch of sun. And it spoke to Lena's heart that she needed to always seek out the sun. And she wrote a book about that called Little Dog in the Sun, which is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful book. But she and Maggie decided that they would write the series of books giving a recipe about that was based on a song like Bad to the Bone-In Ham, or You Say Goodbye, I Say Jello, or I Am the Eggs Man. And they give you not only the history of the song and the band that sang it, but they would also give you a list of songs that were similar to that to listen to while you were cooking. At the time that they did that, there was no such thing as Alexa. And so you couldn't ask anybody to play the songs for you. You had to make a mixtape or a mix CD or whatever if you wanted to listen to those songs. Today, all you do is open her book, get your recipe that you want to cook, read about the band, read about the song, and then ask Alexa to play those songs for you while you're cooking. And it is the most fun to make I Am the Eggs Man and play all of the other Beatles songs that she has recommended for you to listen to while you cook. She did one that's called Recipe Record Series that is just on any kind of music from any era. The next one is Recipe Records, the 60s edition, and it's all the great songs of the 1960s. There are a couple of Beatles songs, but it's everything, all the music of the 60s, from the Detroit sound to the Memphis sound to the jingle jangle music of California, and you get a great cross-section of the 60s. Her third book was a tribute to the Beatles, and it's all Beatles music with Beatles history and stories and trivia and all that. And then about a year and a half ago, she did one that's called The Rolling Stones, Let's Spend the Bite Together. And it's all about the Rolling Stones. So she and I decided about 3 years ago that we wanted to do a podcast contrasting and comparing things in the rock and roll world. So first we did a debate and we compared the Stones and the Beatles, and we did 5 podcasts comparing the Stones and the Beatles. Then we would do George's music versus John's music, and we would do Abbey Road versus Let It Be. And we always compare and contrast. And like the two of you, we also interview people and have guests on. So our theme next year is the Beatles family, and we are going to interview, one month we have Chaz Newby, the first bass player for the Beatles, coming on, and one month we have Rogue and Pete Best coming on. So we have the same sort of format that you have, but we do a lot of comparison contrast.
Wow, it sounds interesting, and technology these days is great.
It is wonderful.
Would you mind if she would come on the show with you the next time, or even by herself would be fine?
Oh, she would absolutely love that. I've told her about both of you, and she is such a fun guest because she knows so much about music and about the Beatles, but also about all the other types of music in the 1960s. So I think y'all would have a great time together.
Yes, it sounds like it would be a great show. I have one more question, then I'm going to hand it over to the Bulldog. Does the artwork and illustrations for your books?
I have different people that do it, and it's always someone who hasn't gotten a chance to really be nationally exhibited. In She Loves You, Volume 3, Enoch Doyle Jeter, who lives in the same town I now live in. When he did the work, we did not live in the same town. I lived somewhere else, and I just happened to move here. But he owns an Irish pub here in Monroe, Louisiana, that has the longest running John Lennon birthday party in America. He started it the year before John passed, and he has had it every year since. And it's twice been recognized by Yoko. She sent thank you notes twice for the party. He has gigantic bands that play, and it's so much fun. We have a birthday cake, and we have a toast to John at 9 o'clock for John's number 9. And it's always great fun. Well, he wrote me a note and said, I don't know if you know that I not only host the John Lennon birthday party, but I'm a lithographer and I teach at the University of Louisiana in Monroe, and I would love to do some artwork for your next book. So he did lithographic prints of every single song on the With the Beatles LP. And, you know, when you do lithography, you have to draw it backwards on stone and then flip the stone over and print it. So every image had to be drawn backwards, and it's an amazing amount of work. And they turned out to be absolutely beautiful. The next book, volume 4, the work was done by a New England artist named Susan Durbacher, who is just another really gifted lady and did some beautiful hand pen and ink sketches of the Beatles. Very different from any work I've ever seen in pen and ink, because most pen and ink is very rigid and hers is very flowing and liquid and beautiful. So they both have volunteered, and I have not chosen anybody to do the work quite yet for volume 5.
Well, enough with me. I'm going to hand it off to the host with the most, the bulldog, Bob Wilson.
Well, in John's story, his lost weekend comes up an awful lot with May Pang, and you mentioned her before. And I was interested in, her having the cross like he wore now that the fans would probably really like to have, many of us. Can you relate? She must have spoken to you at great length. Some of the things she said about that, maybe his beliefs, and near the end of his life, was he still interested in Christianity, or was that before that?
Well, actually, May and I have not talked about that at all. She has been very, very, very kind to not only share with me some of the things that happened during their time in LA, but when they returned to New York City as well, and what happened when they were back in New York, and also some background. People think that Yoko selected May to go with John to Los Angeles, and that there had been no interest in between May and John prior to that. There was sort of an artificial thing, but she was very clear several times about the fact that John had been quite interested in her long before Yoko called her in and asked her to go with him to Los Angeles. In fact, he had told her on the elevator one time that she was beautiful and kissed her. So he was quite taken with her long before she was given that assignment. But we really did not. I haven't talked to May about that. I know that she realizes the importance of this symbolically to many of John's fans, and so she's done a beautiful job of recreating it, and is such a nice person. Of all the people that I've met in the Beatles world, she is in my top 2. Very sweet, very easy to talk to, very unassuming, and yet she played a major role. She got John and Cynthia to bury the hatchet and become friends again after years of bad feelings between the two of them. She convinced John to bring Julian out to Los Angeles and to spend some time with his son and to give him more attention and affection. She convinced John that he was still able to write great songs and that he needed to go back into the studio and start working again at a period when he felt like he wasn't worthy. And she did, there's so many things. She was such a muse for him, and probably doesn't even realize what a great role she played in his story.
And at the end of his life, though, if I can belabor the question, was he still writing any songs like of faith or anything like that?
Yes, those songs that we talked about earlier, Talking to Jesus and Amen and Crossing the Jordan, and there were quite a few that he was working on at that time, but they are no longer available on the internet. I did a show with Ken Mansfield. I don't know if a lot of people know that Ken is a minister as well as a great author. He just wrote The Roof, the book The Roof, but he is also a minister. And when I was doing the John Lennon Hour on Beatles-orama, Ken and I talked about John's search for significance and his search for faith. And I was able at that time, that's probably been 4 or 5 years ago, to play each one of those songs. And then Ken and I commented and talked about them and so forth. I'll see, Bob, if I can get a copy of that for you, because you might want to put that as an attachment to this show for people to listen to.
Or I'd just like to listen to it myself if we can get away with posting it, certainly.
Yeah, I think
we'd love to do that.
Pat Matthews is such a wonderful guy with Beatles-orama Radio, and shameless plug for Pat. He's been doing this long before there was a Beatles channel or any other, thing. And he does it because he loves the Beatles, and it streams 24/7. And he is just a great guy. And I think he would probably give us permission to do that.
And if he wants to come on, he's welcome as well.
Oh, you'd love him. He has a great story.
Oh, hello, everybody. This is Maharishi. I have just come in to say hello to you. I just wanted to say, when I am at my ashram, do you know where I like to go every time when I want to look up all things Beatles, articles and photos? What's for sale on Amazon.com? Or if I just like a chicken to eat? Do you know where I go? I go to Beatles magazine with all these things. And Warren, do you know who runs the Beatles magazine?
I sure do. The lovely Miss Rita.
Lovely Rita, she's so wonderful. She comes to my ashram all the time and we meditate and we eat chicken. So we go to Beatles magazine for all things Beatles. Hello, lovely Rita.
Hello, Rita. And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you
make.
There you go, Jude. You even sang that for me.
I